In most of our lives, order seems planned. We know that to create a company or even to create a picnic, people have to plan things. We had to plan to do this lecture, plan to put it on the website, create the website, plan to get people to come to the website. All of those things take planning. And so we think that order requires planning. But the fact is they are a product of human action, but not of human design. Think about language. Nobody sat down and designed the English language or the French language or Latin. Those languages evolved. People needed to be able to communicate. They needed to be able to come up with new ideas, words for new concepts, new discoveries. Now, there are a few languages that actually were designed, like Esperanto, and what they have in common is that no one speaks them. The language that people actually speak, all the languages that people actually speak, are spontaneously evolved. Take law. A lot of people think law is something that Congress makes or the state legislature makes or even that the Supreme Court makes. But the fact is that originally law just evolved spontaneously as a way for people to settle disputes. My tree fell on your yard. Who's responsible for cleaning it up? People went to neighbors, hopefully wise neighbors, and asked them to settle disputes. And as those disputes were settled, people started relying on those precedents. Well, this is sort of like this previous case, and we made this decision in the previous case. And eventually these rules and these precedents came to be known as law, particularly as the common law. And some of those wise neighbors became specialized as judges, and law evolved that way. And then eventually government came in and it wrote down the common law and it wrote down all the statutes that go with the common law. But the law was originally a product of spontaneous order. Money is another example. People think money is something created by Ben Bernanke, and he's certainly created a lot of it lately. But originally, money evolved spontaneously. I have fish, you have fruit, I want fruit, but you don't want fish, so now we need something that we can exchange as a medium of exchange instead of engaging in direct barter. And so money evolved, and eventually gold and silver in particular came to be regarded as the best natural monies. And then, just like with law, the government stepped in and it said, hey, why don't we just print up paper and hand it out? We promise that there's gold and silver behind it. That's when government got involved, and that was designed. But money itself evolved spontaneously, and especially the economy. Who designs the economy? Who plans the economy? Well, the answer is nobody. Millions and billions of people every day get up thinking, how can I satisfy my own needs? And the basic way that each of us satisfies our needs is coming up with something that somebody else would value. So I may sell my labor or the product of my farm or an idea that I have or goods that I already own. In all of those ways, I am engaging in trade with other people, and the economy evolves spontaneously and economic growth happens until, again, the government steps in and says, we're going to plan the economy, and that generally doesn't work out so well. So one of the key ideas of libertarianism is the idea that most of the order in society evolves spontaneously. It doesn't need to be planned. The great Nobel laureate F.A. Hayek talked about the fatal conceit. That was the title of his last book. And what he meant was that it is the conceit of intellectuals that they can direct resources more efficiently than can millions of independent decision makers. And again, that seems perfectly obvious. Doesn't it make sense that if government planners with a computer decided what everybody should produce and what everything should cost, that would be more efficient than just randomly letting millions and hundreds of millions of people truck and barter and bid in the marketplace? But it turns out it doesn't work very well. One of the great examples of this back during the Clinton administration was when Hillary Clinton organized 500 bureaucrats into 15 committees and 34 working groups to recreate in 100 days 1/7 of the American economy, the healthcare system. She thought that she and her bureaucrats could plan the American healthcare system better than the free market could. Now, we don't have a free market in healthcare, and that's one of the reasons that we have a lot of problems with healthcare. But what we know from historical experience and from economic theory is that competition in the marketplace will produce better results than having a bunch of bureaucrats make plans. But we also need to remember it's not just comprehensive plans like that. Everybody in Congress has got some sort of law or regulation that they think will keep people married or give every child a good home or make people save more for retirement. The argument of the fatal conceit says don't be so sure about that. Don't assume that even your small rules for planning are going to make people act the way you want, and if they do, make better results than they would make on their own. So we have individual rights, and if you've studied political theory, you know the difference between normative and positive theories. Individual rights is a normative theory. Spontaneous order is a positive theory. It's not saying the way things ought to be, it's just saying this is an observation of the way things are. Spontaneous order is the reality of the world. To protect individual rights in spontaneous order, the third key theme in libertarianism, limited government. Limited constitutional government that protects individual rights. And what libertarians often say is delegated, enumerated, and thus limited powers for the government. That is, we have our rights to begin with. We delegate in the Constitution some of our rights to government. We enumerate in the Constitution which rights we're delegating, and therefore we limit the powers of government, delegated, enumerated, and thus limited powers. That is, government is essential, but it must be limited if it's going to protect individual rights. Now, we might sum this up more specifically and say libertarianism is the view that each person has the right to live his life in any way he chooses, so long as he respects the equal rights of others. Libertarians defend each person's right to life, liberty, and property, rights that we have naturally before governments are created. In the libertarian view, all human relationships should be voluntary. The only actions that should be forbidden by law are those that involve the initiation of force against those who have not themselves used force. Actions like murder, rape, robbery, kidnapping, and fraud. And you know, most people habitually believe in and live by this code of ethics. Libertarians believe this code should be applied consistently, and specifically that it should be applied to actions by governments as well as by individuals. Governments should exist to protect rights, to protect us from others who might use force against us. When governments themselves use force against people who have not violated the rights of others, then governments themselves become the rights violators. And thus libertarians condemn such government actions as censorship, the draft, price controls, confiscation of property, regulation of our personal and economic lives. The more complex our society and economy get, the bigger are the problems with government planning. There are three big problems that economists and libertarians can identify with excessive government. First is the totalitarian problem, the problem that such a concentration of power would be an irresistible temptation to abuse. Those with the power make the decisions, probably on the basis of political clout, because it's actually impossible for planners to make right decisions. They don't have the market information they would need to really make the right decisions. Number two is the incentive problem, the lack of inducement for individuals to work hard or work efficiently. And number three, perhaps the least understood, is the calculation problem, the inability of a socialist system without prices or markets to allocate resources according to consumer preferences. In some ways, libertarianism seems to be just the standard framework of modern thought. Individualism, private property, capitalism, equality under the law. And indeed, after centuries of intellectual, political, and sometimes violent struggle, these core libertarian principles have in fact become the basic structure of modern political thought and of modern government. However, 3 additional points need to be made. First, libertarianism is not just these broad liberal principles. Libertarianism applies these principles fully and consistently, far more so than most modern thinkers, and certainly more so than any modern government. Second, while our society remains generally based on equal rights and capitalism, every day new exceptions to these principles are carved out in Washington and in Albany and Sacramento and Austin, and not to mention in London, Beijing, and other capitals. Each new government directive takes a little bit of our freedom, and we should think carefully before giving up any liberty. Third, liberal society is resilient. It can withstand many burdens and continue to flourish, but it is not infinitely resilient. And those who claim to believe in liberal principles but advocate more and more confiscation of the wealth created by productive people, more and more restrictions on voluntary interaction, more and more exceptions to property rights and the rule of law, more and more transfer of power from society to state are, perhaps unwittingly, engaged in the ultimately deadly undermining of civilization.